Hi, I'm Dr. Carol Francis. I am going to talk to you now about very complicated victim looping, and I'm going to give you a story of a person named Joseph. And as you know, this is not a patient of mine, so I'm revealing absolutely no hidden information. Okay, and besides, if this is related to a real person, everything would be changed as well, but we'll go from there. But nonetheless, Joseph. Joseph was beaten by his heroin addict mother for 8 years, from the ages of 3 to 11. And before he was rescued by a very conscientious DCFS social worker and a very healthy foster family, which happens very rarely, he experienced incredible harm to his personality, his development, his neurology, his physiology, because the types of treatment he received by his heroin addict mother were egregious on many levels, to say nothing of the individuals that came to their house that would pay her for money so she could get her heroin. They were abusive to Joseph as well. Well, Joseph was like a feral cat at age 11, and he would hide, he would retreat, he'd scream and protest, he'd kick, and it was all about protecting himself. He would do this in the foster care center, but he definitely did this in the foster family arrangement. And he had no memories whatsoever of having a good parenting experience. He didn't understand kindness, had no rational sense of being able to communicate. This was really primitive experiences. So within the in-home psychotherapy, the therapist would go to the house. The different therapies included physical therapy and a psychiatrist for the pharmaceuticals, social worker, and also a psychologist, and also an attachment therapist who would work on that. Then the parents were very involved. The foster family was very involved, and they were very careful, very reliable in reparenting, providing reparenting experiences for Joseph. And Joseph began to slowly shift from being a terrified victim. So he became a less damaged teenager in about age 16 to 17, hard because of all those hormones, but he began to develop the basic social skills and some successes at school as well. So that enabled him to be able to go into having education, but he had to maintain all the therapies and didn't understand a social arrangement. I want you to know that the recovery continues into his 30s. I want you just to pay attention to that. But in the process of it, he has developed really humane attitudes, emotional diversity, and socially satisfying relationships to a certain level. And his identification as a kind and productive person has definitely developed. Now, this is an extreme situation, there is no question, but it isn't unheard of in child abuse situations for children to have extreme complications along these lines. So he was a victim of his mother's heroin use and the way in which she earned the money for the heroin and the people that he was exposed to. It took years, decades of interventions to get to be where he's at and make the shifts and feel like he was in the middle of recovery and maybe having forms and variations of thriving. That's an example of what it's like to work in recovery and have a whole team working with you to recover. Your situation is probably not like Joseph's, but you have to discern what sort of complicated circumstances you are coping with and what sort of recovery process you want to move into and what type of team you want to develop. Because the last thing you want to do is to have your future potential, your future identity, your future self, your future relationships completely harmed by the type of abuse and trauma you experienced. So you know that, otherwise you wouldn't be taking these classes. But I want you to recognize that one of the ways that you shift out of being a victim is to recognize this is complicated. I got in here in a complicated way, and it may be complicated getting out of here, and I have to move myself forward. I want to introduce you to another individual that might give us even more empathy, and the name of this individual is Tyler. Let me get to that in the book. Tyler had several traumas which compounded his or her military service. I chose the word Tyler so it could be male and female. He or she was sexually harassed repeatedly by the captain in Afghanistan. His or her comrades were exploded into bits by mines while he or she survived in the third vehicle of their convoy. His or her division completely dismissed any of the accusations against the sexual abuse and the inappropriateness of the captain while in Afghanistan. So when he or she returned to civilian life, there were so many residual complications related to the sexual abuse by the captain, the complicity by the rest of the team, the horrors that they experienced watching their comrades being blown up, and the way in which the government and the military hierarchy did not respond to the needs that were associated being abused by the captain. Now, you may think that these are made up stories, but they are not. They're confabulated, they're put together, but these are not. These come from stories that are actually available for you to read on the internet and have been authenticated. Now, let's think a little bit. Should Tyler still feel like a victim? Well, in a sense, yes, because they may still be in the process of trying to move themselves through the justice system of this. Secondly, they have to understand the layers of victimization that they've gone through to understand the complexities of what both their body and their mind and their emotions and personality are really dealing with. So how does an individual start that? Well, I've mentioned in the previous one all sorts of different therapeutic approaches that I use, and the book has so much more available. But there is a series of 16 statements that are in this book that help a person process their victim position and where it came from and shift more into thriving as a different identity. So I'm going to give you these 16 statements, and what you should do is stop the video and write an answer to these. The first question is, how did you fall into being a victim in each of the situations that you found yourself in? How did this begin? Secondly, how did you become helpless in the context of all of that? So examine your sensations of helplessness. Now, the reason that's really important is that as a victim, we learn to be helpless, and to unlearn our helplessness, we have to empower ourselves. But first we have to develop kind of an awareness. We look at ourselves and go, wow, there were the spots where I learned to be helpless. Okay, so that's a very important question to answer. Thirdly, how did you knowingly or unwisely partner with your abuser or traumatizer? That's a tough question to answer. Not trying to do this so you feel blame or shame, but how did you get wrapped up in the flow? How did you become partner to this? What was this? What were the steps? And even if it meant that you were completely kidnapped and blindfolded and dragged off, that's not you doing it. You're not responsible for the abuser or traumatizer, but you might want to look at, well, how did I, in the efforts to survive and the efforts to endure, how did I feel like I had to change and mold my personality so that I kind of partnered with the abuser, traumatizer? And how am I still doing it? How am I still treating myself badly? How am I still treating myself helpless? How am I still treating myself with that same sort of response that makes me feel like I am still there? Then, how you decide to no longer be a victim is very important. And related to that is, how did you escape? How did you escape the actual violent, horrible situation and leap into a position where you could look back and go, there it was? And those aspects of who you are, you want to trace them so that you can kind of know who you were in that process. You're still in the victim position, but you're shifting from victim to hero. You're shifting from victim to trying to change things, and you want to be able to kind of feel the flow that happened for you, with you, by you in that process. Now you also want to think, how are you still blaming other people for the circumstances around you being a victim? Maybe rightfully or wrongfully blaming them. Just say, I'm blaming people for this. This is who I'm blaming. This is why I'm blaming. Just that you can kind of express blame and the anger with that, because the more you're blaming someone, the more you're actually putting yourself more and more adherently into the victim position. How would you want to take revenge or make them pay for the ills done? So now you're exploring your imagination. Never want you to become violent. That will not help you. But nonetheless, you want to get your fantasies and thoughts and wishes out on paper so you can just stare at it and go, yep, that's what I'm occupied with. That's what I'm feeling. Because those same feelings keep you stuck in the victim consciousness, okay? Very important that you respect it, not act on it. How you understandably react with your anger, your depression, and helplessness, and if your abuser escapes. So how do you still reenact your responses knowing that the abuser's out there, free, unpunished, and maybe doing harm to others and hopefully never to you again? How is the system failing you? How's the system failing to punish the abuser? How's the system failing to put an end to these sorts of things? Because again, as the system fails, there's a part of you that says, I have to stay a victim as long as the system fails me. I have to stay a victim as long as my victimizer's out there. I have to stay a victim as long as I have someone to blame for what went on with me. Then you also have to write down, sorry to pause there, but you have to write down, how do I plan on fighting through the legal system, the societal system, and how is that fight going to keep me adherent to a victim position, and how can I manage that in a healthy way without getting stuck there? So related to that is, how are you holding on to your victim identity in order to sustain a legal or social or personal justice point of view and campaign? How are you misinterpreting some of the situations in your current life because you're still looking at everything as if you are being abused? So like in the first example of Joseph, he was still interpreting his family, his adopting family, as still wanting to victimize him because that's all he knew. So he misinterpreted the gestures that were extended to him as equally as violent or upsetting or vile as what he went through with his heroin addict mother. And so in what ways, it's maybe more subtle, are you still kind of misinterpreting things around you because you're so accustomed to seeing everything from the template, the vision, the perspective of being a victim? Very important to self-analyze. How are you looking for others to rescue you, and you're holding on to being a victim in hopes that someone else will rescue you or give you intervention, or will find that yes, your victim situation is real, and you're getting affirmation, you're getting confirmation of that? How are you holding on to being a victim, waiting for people to do that? Because that is understandable. And how do you begin to recognize that your attitudes and actions and emotions begin to portray you only as a victim because you haven't remembered to feel like any other aspect of life? So you're going to need next to figure out, how do I develop identities that are not victim-based? How might you help others without retriggering your own victim identity as well, in helping them recover so that you have a sense of, I can do this, I can actually be a person who's recovered and help other people do it as well. Now, those are questions to ask yourself. I want you to take those questions, stop the video, or maybe listen to the video again, and answer those questions as one of your knowledge gain and self-reflection activities. So in light of that, all of those will give you the perspectives as to why you might be adhering to your victim identity. Then next, I also want you to realize that there are some ways to imagine yourself as a thriver, and that's going to be in our last class. And it's also going to be in the meditations as well. So the last class, which is going to start very soon, you do after you've kind of written the answers to these particular questions, because you're talking about, okay, this is me as victim, this is me as still being victim even though I'm not in that situation. And now, can I live outside of being a victim? And you will integrate, be respectful, but what does this whole world of not being a victim look like in light of my history? Okay, I'll meet you there in the next class. Bye.